Hi everyone. This lecture is going to be about existential theory and the use of existentialism in um, psychotherapy. Um, but let's first talk about what exactly existentialism is. Now, existentialism really is a branch of philosophy that emerged in the probably the mid part of the 19th century, although that's a really generic time frame because certainly its ideas were present much before then. Probably as many as 100 or 150 years prior to then. So, as a subject, existentialism is really concerned with meaning and isolation, anxiety, despair, alienation. Um, and the reason it gained some prominence in sort of the 20th century was partly in response to World War II, particularly as the extent and the sort of severity of the horrors of the concentration camps emerged in Europe and in the U.S. And later, existentialism sort of took hold in the U.S. as the threat of nuclear bombs as part of the Cold War sort of cast a shadow over people's lives. Um, so believe it or not, though, in the late part of the 19th century, people like Marx were actually writing about alienation. And so, like I said, existentialism has roots that extend, much earlier than sort of the 20th century into the 19th century and things like that. So where Marx was talking about alienation, for example, um, one of the things that the Industrial Revolution did was it divorced craftsmen, people who made things, from sort of their final product. The Industrial Revolution, developed things like the assembly line and interchangeable parts and so on and so forth. And now people's jobs would be just to do one little part of a much longer process in making a thing, whatever that thing would be. So they were sort of alienated. They were there was distance between what it is they were actually doing and what this idea of the final product was. And that's one of the earlier references we have to alienation. But just sort of what it has to do generally is that people are divorced from what it is their contribution to society or the greater good is. And the sort of 19th century brand of existentialism comes from this idea that there could be something that could end our world at any time, and we don't necessarily know that it's coming. And that illusion, of course, illusion, ALLUSION, that illusion, of course, is to the nuclear bomb. And this idea that the world could end any minute, and we just wouldn't necessarily know that it's going to end because we don't realize that bombs have been deployed or set off or something like that. And so the idea here really is, if something is going to end the world at any minute, what are we going to do to live meaningfully and make a contribution sort of in the here and now? And that's where, like I said here a few minutes ago, the existential's concern with meaning and things like that kind of came into play. As a sort of broad philosophical movement, existentialism was sort of a response to nihilism. Nihilism was this idea that life was pretty meaningless and pretty pointless. But existentialism sort of put a little bit more of a positive spin on that. And came up with this idea that we're able to make and define what it is that's meaningful to us, and that's where sort of the treatment and psychotherapy portion comes in. But let's just review real quickly a few of the ideas that the existential philosophers sort of came up with. So Soren Kierkegaard was among the first of the existential philosophers, and he developed this idea that humans are a project. We're always creating ourselves rather than discovering ourselves. And that really says something about this idea of determination, right? We're able to determine who it is we are. Our destiny is not foreordained by some higher power or our parents or, our genes or something like that. Kierkegaard also developed this idea of angst, which for him was a combination of dread and anxiety. And that angst really makes us, that's an energy that drives us to make meaningful decisions, things that make contributions to the world. Friedrich Nietzsche was another one of the existential philosophers, and he was pretty opposed to this idea that humans are rational. He argued that people have the willpower to make their own decisions, and through the process of realizing that power, that we can sort of make our own decisions and create our own destiny, we have the potential to be sort of creative and original and really live authentically. Nietzsche was sort of famously opposed to the idea of a higher power, and it would have been that higher power that sort of in previous formulations of the world would have come up with a person's path or course through life. But Nietzsche was pretty opposed to the idea of a higher power, and he really said that humans are their own higher power, and they're the ones that can sort of make their own destiny. So Martin Heidegger was a German philosopher, and he argued that moods and feelings tell us whether or not we're living authentically, and authentically really meant true to ourselves. It's a subjective definition that each person comes up with, but the power to define that sort of authenticity is what actually makes a person human. And coming to grips with it is sort of the process of dealing with anxiety and alienation and things like that. So Jean-Paul Sartre was a French philosopher, and he was concerned primarily with free will. But he said that free will encompasses so many possibilities that it really can feel overwhelming, and that was sort of his formulation of anxiety. And so to limit those behavioral possibilities to a sort of a manageable set of choices, we rely on our past, which acts as a trap, and that's what can be harmful. And so Sartre would have argued that realizing and acting upon the true extent of our free will, and maximizing the utility or the good that a person can do through those behavioral possibilities is sort of a key part of being human. So the existential philosophers were sort of working well before the existential psychotherapists, and there's a couple of key people to know in the who sort of transferred the work of the philosophers over to the world of psychotherapy, and Viktor Frankl was one of them. Although he was Viktor Frankl developed this thing called logotherapy, which is just a meaning therapy essentially. He wrote a book actually called Man's Search for Meaning, which is sort of one of those things that's sells well perennially because its ideas are so well defined. But Viktor Frankl survived the concentration camps. He was a German Jew, and he would have been imprisoned in the system of concentration camps. But it was his survival that sort of led him to this idea of meaning. And so he really viewed the central work of therapy as defining and creating meaning for yourself. We're free to define what is meaningful for us, although that the freedom that's presented by the range of possibilities of what could be meaningful for us can be a little bit anxiety provoking. But for him, the meaning would have come from work or family, loving someone, that kind of thing, and he would have viewed therapy as a way to sort of find and define meaning. Of course, suffering was a part of meaning as well, and he would have argued that people can use suffering as a way to sort of define what their lives have been about. But again, we see sort of um, a couple of key themes emerging here, and that's anxiety that sort of emerges from existential dread and meaning. These are things that we'll sort of talk about throughout the duration of this lecture here. So Rollo May was an American psychologist who brought existentialism to the U.S. He did that primarily through a book that he called Existence, A New Dimension in Psychiatry and Psychology. Um, um, and Rollo May thought that we all sort of had this innate desire to grow to maturity and independence, but we're comforted by sort of where we are right now, and so the idea of changing our current circumstances is daunting. And his ideas would have been about how to encourage people to grow and realize their potential towards maturity and independence. And then Irving Yalom, who is, as of 2019, still alive, did an awful lot with existential psychotherapy as well, and he came up with these ideas of the givens of existence. So these are the things that everyone has to face as just as a function of being alive, and that's isolation versus having relationships with others, a death versus living fully, and meaningless versus meaning. So let's talk about some basic ideas of existential psychotherapy. There's really no core set of techniques. There's no sort of predefined questions to ask or stance to take. Really, the only sort of key things to know as an existential psychotherapist is to have a significant and healthy respect for persons, and to acknowledge that there's multiple ways of understanding people. Therapy really in the existential tradition is really understanding what it means to be human. And it's about working through the dilemmas of contemporary life. Isolation, alienation, meaninglessness. How do we help people when life feels challenging? Ultimately, although existential philosophy is sort of concerned with isolation and alienation and meaninglessness, existential psychotherapy is really sort of takes a more positive approach in my mind, and it's that life is discovering and sort of making sense of our existence, and ultimately defining a meaningful path for ourselves. Now, the range, I've said this before, but let me say it again, the range of possibilities that could exist on that path of meaningfulness is intimidating, and that's existential anxiety, when you sort of feel that intimidation. But coming to realize the power that's inherent in the range of possibilities and the range of human potential is sort of what's key. That's sort of the positive and humanistic spin that existentialism put on psychotherapy. So there are sort of six sort of dimensions of the human condition. That's the capacity for self-awareness, this idea that one has both a broad range of freedom to define meaning, and then the responsibility to make a contribution. Third dimension of the human condition is creating one's identity and establishing meaningful relationships. And if you sort of think about the way that bullet point is phrased, it's really moving away from isolation, and so it's sort of not falling into the lazy pit of isolation, but creating a purposeful and meaningful identity, and then using that to as a basis to which one should form relationships. And it's through relationships that one can make contributions and things like that. So the fourth dimension of the human condition is the search for meaning, the search for purpose and values and goals. The fifth is this idea that anxiety is just going to be a condition of living. There's sort of three kinds of anxiety in the existential tradition. There's existential anxiety, normal anxiety, excuse me, and then a form of neurotic anxiety. Normal anxiety is an appropriate response to an upcoming event. It's measured. It's in proportion to that upcoming event. And we can use that anxiety to make positive changes, like prepare for said event. Existential anxiety is sort of this unavoidable result about being confronted with the givens of existence, like the pit of isolation and the pit of despair, that kind of thing. And then neurotic anxiety is sort of anxiety that's out of proportion to a situation. There's a typo on the slide there that should say out of proportion to a situation. And so existential and normal anxieties are sort of reasonable expectations. Neurotic anxiety is sort of the thing that's kind of pathological, and that's what many people come to therapy to sort of try and come to some understanding about. And then the last dimension of human condition is sort of an awareness of death, or the end of being. That's what's meant by non-being there. And so in the face of our impending death, what is it that we're going to do to leave the world in a better place than we found it? So the goals of existential therapy are not really all that different from sort of from humanistic psychology in general, but they're to help clients be more present with themselves and with others. The goal is to sort of assist clients in identifying ways that they get in the way of themselves. So how do they interfere with being present in their lives and others? And then really to challenge clients to assume responsibility for designing the course of their lives, and encourage clients to sort of maximize their sort of presence and maximize the potential of their lives. And so the therapist characteristics in the existential tradition are not particularly well defined, but like any good sort of humanistic practitioner, the therapist should be honest, should display integrity and authenticity and courage. And then the therapist should be sort of, comfortable and brave in the challenges of self-discovery and defining what course it is one's life is sort of going to take. So there's probably three phases of existential therapy. There's the phase of identifying and clarifying assumptions about the world and the source of problems. That phase involves some reflecting on existence and examining the contributions of different systems in creating those problems. The second phase is sort of examining the sources of authority in a person's life. And the sort of broad goal of that phase is to define or articulate a life that a client considers worthy, and sort of come to grips with the power that one has to sort of make that determination. And that we don't need to rely on, say, parents or a religious tradition or something external to sort of set that value system for us. Although we're certainly willing to, or certainly able to, use the contribution of those different things, ultimately, our value system should be something that we've defined for ourselves. And then the third phase is a generalization phase, and that's applying what one has learned in therapy really to other domains of one's life. Broadly, I think this phase is really about being comfortable with the power one has to define the course and path of one's life. So strengths and weaknesses, we'll conclude here. Strengths and weaknesses of existentialist psychotherapy. It's a strength. The strengths come from its sort of universality. All people are sort of confronted with death or confronted with a time of non-being. And so what we do with the time that we have between now and that point of non-being, um, to make a meaningful life is a fairly universal theme. It's subjective, and it's phenomenological. So every person is free to sort of define what their life looks like for them. And as therapists, we should endeavor to understand each person's life on her own terms, as opposed to some sort of universal set of terms. Um, there's a big focus on sort of the human dimension of therapeutic relationships, which is sort of its lasting contribution to psychotherapy. And then it's this idea that it emphasizes freedom and responsibility is considered by some a strength as well. Um, of course, some people consider that freedom and responsibility a weakness as well, and that is particularly true when um, existential therapy is thought about as being done in countries with more repressive governments and things like that. Um, on the other hand, existentialism is pretty individualistic, and it sort of downplays the role that social forces have in creating problems, the role that sort of macro forces have in creating those problems. It downplays the role of the family or the importance of culture, and certainly in countries where cultural identity is more important, or in spaces where cultural identity is more important. Existential therapy has sort of its weakness there, and it's also rather philosophical. It's not nearly as concrete as some of the other um, therapeutic traditions that we've talked about, like behaviorism, for example. So, just by way of conclusion here, if if you've ever done an exercise where the question has been, "What do you want to put on your gravestone?" That's essentially an existential exercise. And the point of that is to say, what is it that you want to be remembered for? And then what you do between now and when one sort of gravestone is etched out is sort of how you live meaningfully and authentically. And that, so the act of sort of defining how you want to be remembered, or how a person wants to be remembered, is a pretty powerful idea. And it 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 can have a profound effect on shaping how we live, sort of in the day to day. Now, the existential tradition would say we don't just do that once, but we need to sort of do that on a continual basis, and so we're sort of continually um, redefining, reanalyzing, reevaluating um, our goals for living meaningfully, and then acting in service of what it is to uh, to realize those goals. And that's sort of the power and the anxiety that the the breadth of what those goals could be, and the responsibility of living meaningfully, is sort of what what defines both the stress and the power of human life. So I guess that's all the comments I have. I will leave it there. Thanks for watching.